All right, I'm going to kick us off today. Welcome to our webinar on the changing landscape of highly selective college admissions. My name is Lisa Carlton. I'm the founder and CEO of College Matchpoint, and I've been working with students in the college admissions process for about 15 years. And joining me today is Claudia Salinas, who has about 17 years in highly selective college admissions and is now a consultant on the College Matchpoint team. So we're looking forward to talking to you all today, answering your questions. There is a Q&A, so please put your questions in there and we'll be happy to answer those. Bob Carlton, our other co-founder, is going to be running the technical side of things for us today. And we will be, people always ask this, I'll tell it, and if you ask it again, I'll tell it, is that if we are going to be recording today, and we also will be sending you the slides. So you don't have to worry about taking a lot of notes and all of that, because we are going to be providing you with that information. So before we start our webinar, I think that it's really important to talk about, what are we going to talk about today and why are we talking about it? We're going to talk about what highly selective colleges look for, how to achieve depth in activities, and about application strategy. But before we do that, I want to talk a minute about why we're talking about highly selective college admissions and to kind of frame the conversation, because we know we've been doing this webinar for a number of years, and of course, admissions changes every year, and highly selective college admissions has changed a lot, where I now tell students, I used to tell students, this isn't like when your parents went to college. I now tell students, this isn't like when your sibling went to college. A lot is changing. We've seen a lot of change over this COVID period. And so it's important to kind of understand the context of right now. It's also important for you to have good, solid information. And so our goal today is to provide you that information. For students who are parents who are on here, our goal is not to smash dreams, be negative, anything like that, but we do want to provide you with the current data and information on highly selective colleges, and it's sometimes a little startling. So I just want to kind of throw that out there before we start, because I think if you haven't been in the college admissions arena in a while, it is surprising. And oftentimes parents will say to me, what do you mean? That college is hard to get into? It was like a safety school when I went to school. So a lot of things has changed. So let's jump in. There's obviously more than 3,000 great colleges out there. And the key for students is to find the college where you're going to thrive. And that is really the goal of this conversation, is to help you understand where you can thrive and what that looks like in a highly selective college. So what makes a college selective? If you ask a bunch of people like me, you're going to get a few different answers. But what we would say is that colleges that are accepting somewhere between, 10% to 20% of their applicants are highly selective. And I'll go into the reason why this is happening. But when you think about college admissions, once you start tweaking under that 20% number, you're getting into very large applicant pools, typically of very qualified candidates. So therefore, it's not like where you rank in your high school. Now everybody that ranks like you is in that pool, so it becomes a different situation. Now there's also, I think this is important for us to kind of lay out before we dig into what makes a college selective, is there's also highly selective majors. And I would say this is something that we're seeing more and more of. So you've got the nursing, the health majors, very selective. Business, I think what we're seeing so far this year is starting to look more and more like engineering and computer science, very competitive. So you could have a college that maybe if you looked at their overall acceptance rate, it might be 40%, 50%, but that's not at the business school or the engineering school or the computer science school, pre-med, those kinds of things. So we have to look at highly selective majors, pre-health, pre-med, business, engineering, the sciences, and computer science when you're thinking about selectivity. So we've got the selectivity of the overall college, and we've got the selectivity of majors. And the information on majors is very, very hard to get. So people always ask us, like, how do you get that? That's tricky. There's no source for that exactly. It's more, having done it over time and you kind of learn it, but there is no good source for that. Now let's talk about why colleges have become so competitive. Basically, a lot of it is math. If you look at the common application, so there's one application source for colleges. What we've seen over time is a rising number of applications, okay? So when I started working with students, it was typical for a student to apply to about 8 colleges. Now, I would say it's quite typical for students to apply to 12, 15. Had a student this year that applied to 22 colleges. That's not what I would recommend, but so as we have these more and more numbers coming into students applying, this makes the pool so large, and it makes more kids for the colleges to choose from. In addition, there's cultural norms about students deciding where they want to go, going further away from home. There's a lot of marketing going on here. So it's not unusual for a student to come into my office and say, oh, look, X college wants me. They just sent me this piece of mail. Sadly, the truth is we have no idea if X college wants you or not yet because they haven't read your application. They do know they want you to apply. Why do they want you to apply? Because they look more selective when you apply. So there's a lot of sophisticated games going on in terms of marketing, names being sold through PSAT, all of that, that definitely impacts this whole process of highly selective schools. And then, the technology of it becoming easier, quote unquote, to apply. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but because of the common application, all of that has created a rise in applications. And I think now I might even put in one more little thing in there, is that as the landscape has gotten more competitive, a strategy that many students are using is, I'm just going to throw it out to all of them and see which one sticks. So that also kind of for each college makes their number bigger, if that makes sense to you. And again, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A if you have questions as we go along. Now let's talk a little bit about what we see this season. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about this season and the last season, and give you some data that we're seeing to help you kind of understand where things are now. One of the trends that was certainly happening before the COVID period and just continues to happen, and what we're seeing is more and more schools kind of jumping on this bandwagon, is filling their class with early decision or restricted early action. We'll talk about the difference in those a little bit later. But you see a school like Tulane, which 2 years ago did not even have an early decision option for students. So that wasn't even a possibility. They're filling 57% of their class early decision. So what do you think happens at Tulane when you apply regular? Well, at that point, they filled up a huge chunk of their class. Now they're looking for those kids that they want to add to fill the class out. So it becomes much more selective at regular decision. So this data is really important. Now there's certain schools like a Tufts, which still hasn't really gone up quite so high. University of Virginia is another one that just added ED last year. And so they're at 30%, tweaking up slightly from the year before. So when you're thinking about colleges and where you might ultimately apply, this number is important because it tells you a little bit about the story of the selectivity that's going to happen in regular decision. A few just kind of stats just to kind of frame things. 96% of the admitted students at Brown were in the top 10% of their class. And I think top 10%, top 8% tends to be about what one would think of in highly selective admissions. You know, Penn and Duke reject 3 out of 5 valedictorians. So that's the #1 student, okay? 27% of accepted students at Dartmouth are expected to be the valedictorian or the salutatorian. And then you can see like at U Chicago, the average test score 15, 18, 34 on the ACT, which again are about, you know, where a student wants to be at in terms of test scores if they're going to be applying to highly selective colleges. So this starts to frame for you a little bit what the colleges are looking for. Now let's talk a little bit about what's shifted. I'm sure many of you are aware that we've got the test optional world. Many of the schools were test optional, and we'll talk about that. But I'll tell you what we've really seen is transcripts have become even more important. Colleges have always been digging into your transcript, but I think we are seeing, for probably 2 reasons, really. One is test optional. So you've got that piece. The other is the kids have not had as many opportunities for engagement because of COVID. So that transcript, you know, I always used to say, and I still say to students, you know, the transcript's like the big enchilada, you know, it's the thing in the middle that you can't run from. What are they looking at in transcript, which we'll talk about, you know, is obviously your grades and the rigor of your coursework. Test scores are, and the test optional, you know, has typically been sort of a validator of academic strength, right? And so I would say, and we'll talk further, that you know, test scores have remained important is what we see. There are some places that are genuinely test optional. We definitely see some kids getting in. I don't have examples of students getting in test optional at the most selective schools in the last 2 years. So I do think test scores are still important. However, I don't think they're as important as they were before. So that means that transcript, which is your grades and your coursework, which means it really does matter that you're taking the most rigorous courses. And although I know students a lot of times tell me, well, it's a B, but it's really an A because I got the extra points. It really needs to be an A in the most rigorous coursework. And then the depth of engagement that a student has, because you get all these students applying and they look really similar oftentimes in their transcripts and their test scores. So it is their engagement that is oftentimes that thing that is separating out the groups, if you will. So that piece is really important. And that's something at a state or a national level, not like, you know, doing a summer program in the 10th grade that you pay to do is a great thing to explore interests and involvement. But for students who are aiming at top schools, it really is important that you're not just doing, you know, paid programs that are not, you know, somewhat competitive to get in. And then also common good activities, things that are impacting, showing character. Colleges do right now really, really, really care about character. So I'll say a little bit more about test optional. I think I pretty much said this. We're going to see, I think, in the highly selective schools, I think we're going to mostly see test optional stay in place. We've had a few places like Georgetown, which has always loved test scores. They have kept that. But I think we'll see test optional remain in a lot of the selective schools. I think as we go through all the colleges in the country, we're seeing the East Coast and the West Coast sort of holding on to test optional, and we're seeing the middle of the country, especially the South, adding test scores back in. But in the highly selective schools, I think we will, for the most part, see test optional remain. What I do want to say about this is I think students got super excited. And one of the reasons I think we saw such an enormous increase in the last cycle, we're not seeing quite the same level of increases. So we're seeing it kind of hold steady or go down ever so slightly, only because it went up so much in the number of applications last year. But I think we will see it remain, but I think you really want to aim to have a test score that is worthy of a highly selective school, and that should be an important part of your strategy. Now, this is always super interesting to me. What is the trait of a student who may want to consider highly selective schools? Because having done this a long time, I do see certain traits. Self-driven is the number one trait I see, and I see it year after year. I think obviously all of us, I'm a parent, I have 2 children. I think they're the greatest people in the world. And so sometimes as parents, we have a vision for our students that we want to see play out because we know how great they are. But what I know about the students, and I've had the joy of working with many students who've gone to highly selective schools, is that those students are driving their process. I just met with two today who probably will land in highly selective. They told me what they needed. They told me where, they're driving it. They love having a guide on the side. They're choosing activities because they're actually intellectually curious. So yes, I want to do an independent study on this because that would be so interesting and cool. Like, they have that internal drive that cannot be created. And so I think this is a really important thing to think about when you're thinking about your college list. Students, do I have that drive? And parents, is it my drive or their drive? I think is super, super important. They have to be competitive. They've got to be comfortable being in a competitive process. This is a competitive process. And some students will say to me, I just don't really want to do that, which is totally understandable. And like I said, intellectually curious as well. So what do highly selective colleges look for? What are they looking for? Claudia, I'm going to throw it to you.
Well, thank you. So having spent a whole career on the highly selective side, I want to talk a little bit about the holistic application process. This is the way in which highly selective schools are evaluating and reviewing your application in this process. And so usually what is the main course, what I would like to say is the turkey to your Thanksgiving dinner are your academics, your transcript, and your test scores, okay? So you can't come to Thanksgiving without that turkey, and for those of you who are vegetarian, tofurkeys, but you need to be able to present that main platter to even be seated at the table, okay? So in terms of the other variables that are part of this process, there are many sides to this course. Okay, some of you are going to have a phenomenal resume. Some of you are going to have really great essays. Part of this may also include major or demonstrated interest, but it's the entire meal together and how it presents itself. The cranberry sauce, in my case, tamales are a side in our family. It's all those extra pieces that makes it the meal. And that's how colleges are really looking at your application, is seeing how all of these different pieces come together. So when we're looking at your application and we're honing in on specific areas, we are looking through a lens to understand what is motivating you, what's bringing you to this particular table. And so when we're looking at these things as admissions professionals, some of the things that come right up to mind are things like intellectual curiosity. And what you're seeing in this diagram is that it's not just one piece, it's common good, it's fit to major, and the interaction of those different pieces coming together that can present itself in a really great way for the institution. Intellectual curiosity is just the first step, but the other pieces matter quite a bit. So what's making this strong academic profile? Okay, so first and foremost, as I said before, grades and scores are definitely part of the evaluation process. You need to be taking the most rigorous courses available and succeeding in those courses, because everyone else who is applying to these highly selective institutions are doing that as well. They're trying to be well prepared for these types of institutions. So they are also taking these different courses that are preparing them. So it means if you have a performance issue in a particular area that you're not as strong at. So for example, if you're an engineering or STEM student who may struggle a little bit with English, or if you're a really strong humanities student who does well in English and foreign language, but you struggle a little bit in math, that's okay. But by and large, your performance overall has to be strong. So when it comes to the curiosity piece, I love this quote, by the way, just because it is very much what our community is looking at. It's really about authentic curiosity. What are you genuinely interested in? And I can tell you from experience, you can really tell the difference between people who are simply checking a box and people who are truly engaged with the work that they are doing. Okay, and that makes a significant difference in the application because it impacts the types of activities that you're willing to get involved with and how you're willing to stretch yourself in terms of involvement. So when we start talking about common good, I think this is sort of, I think a lot of people are like, what does that really mean? And I usually ask students to think about like, how do you think about the community around you? You know, what problems or challenges are you seeing in the community around you? And what are you doing to be engaged with the problem solving of that? Colleges and universities are truly in tune with this particular piece, and you'll often see it reflected in either their mission or their vision statements for the college or university. So they're wanting to involve students who are wanting to get into what is happening in the world around them.
And I would add that the common good is something that we've really seen shift during COVID. And so many of my students will come in and they will say, I am so excited because I got 100 service hours. I got 150 service hours. So we've been in this kind of push, if you will, and we have organizations like that are great organizations, but are really just like pushing to do lots of different activities. I think the trick here, which is challenging, and I'm really noticing students having a hard time making a shift to this, it's asking the question that Claudia just said. It's a harder question to answer. What is the impact you want to make? I've started doing this activity with younger students because I think it is something that students have to think about early in order to be ready to answer these kinds of questions. And one of the things that we saw such a shift on is the questions that colleges are asking when in the application. So hard to think all the way out to you're going to be filling out your college application. What is it you care about? Where do you want to impact? Many of those questions came up and are coming up. And we saw our students so struggling on these. And so this is a conversation that also is great dinner table conversation. Like as a family, what are the issues that we're concerned about and how do we want to get involved? You know, I've seen quite a few students doing some really great work around hunger, around homelessness, around the environment. But they're not just collecting hours. And our collection doesn't work at highly selective schools. So you've really got to think about getting out, shifting a mindset, if you will, from I'm going to go do a whole bunch of hours over here to what do I really care about that I would want to impact? Because students are going to have to write about that on the other side. And just like Claudia said, it's easy to kind of see through. She's been in that role. You know, I don't think I said at the beginning, Claudia's worked at Cornell, she's worked at Rice, she's worked at Harvey Mudd. So she's read on the other side of this. Really important that that students are thinking about this, because I think this is here to stay.
So on the other side, there are influences that are happening that can be a little bit out of the student's control. And I think this is what's really hard for families to kind of digest, because you really are working hard. Your students are working hard to put their best foot forward. And we see that effort. And so it's really hard to understand that colleges and universities are their own institutions, and they're serving their own mission, their own values, and they're reporting to their own board or their own chancellors on their campuses. So oftentimes what's hard for us to comprehend when we're students in this process is that it's not really always about you as an individual. The responsibility of the college or the university that is selecting a class is that they are really building a class of lots of different people. Okay, so when we're looking at that overall composition, they're looking at the overall community, not just who is coming in that first year as a freshman, but who is already in their community, what is happening within their community. So if it's a challenge that they're wanting to shift a mindset in a particular area, they may be wanting to bring in more folks who are coming from the other perspective. Okay, so the other piece to this is that if you're really going to be an institution that is highly selective and is seen as one of the top schools, then you are invested in making sure that your class is really creating the best learning environments possible. That means a diversity of perspective, whether it's rural or more local, whether it is students coming from urban or suburban, maybe it's the student coming from an island experience, but you want those different experiences. You want those different perspectives in your class. And more importantly, you as students who are applying are also applying because that is what is attracting you to those schools. So they're looking for it on a number of different levels. The final piece of this is institutional priorities. There are things that are happening on the college side that has nothing to do with the admissions process. There are priorities that have been set there by others and that admissions offices have to abide by. So if an institution has a new charge, then admissions sort of has to fall in line. And that can come at any point in the season. And so I'll share an example of one place where I worked where in the middle of the reading season, that's what we call application review on the admission side of the desk is reading season. There was a charge to take more students from Saudi Arabia because the kingdom had made a very large donation to the institution. And so is there any way that you as a student could have predicted that they were going to be looking for more Saudi students? No. Was there any way that you could suddenly become, a citizen of the kingdom? No. There are things happening at work that are behind the scenes that are influencing this process that has nothing to do with you. And I say all of this because you should not be chasing the things that you think a college wants. You should be doing the things that bring you joy and that make life interesting for you and where you feel engaged, because that's what the college is ultimately going to be looking at when it comes to the review process. Okay, so trying to mold yourself for them won't work. Be your own person in this process.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Claudia. So let's talk a little more about what depth means in the college process, because I think it's such a huge part. as I said, when we started, one of the things that happens is that, and I see this with my students, is the grades and test score piece, if they're applying to a lot of highly selective colleges, they look really similar, right? I mean, there's certainly difference, nuanced differences, but they look very, very similar. So when a college, when they've made it kind of through that first hurdle and they're going to get a second read, so much of it, part of it is what Claudia just said. It's all those institutional priorities, which we can't solve for, right? We just can't. And it's what have you as a student, what is it that you love and what is it that you've done? And at College Matchpoint, we have kind of something we call I-4, which is just that the student has aptitudes, skills, and motivations, those things that bring them joy, that make them tick, that make them different than their friends, right? And in 9th and 10th grade, most students are on the right-hand side, as they should be, exploring interests, getting involved, and trying things out, trying things on to see what they're interested in. But as students go through high school, they need to be hopefully moving towards some aspects that show initiative and impact. And that's going to be really important in them being able to stand out. And they should be students who want to show initiative and impact. In other words, they're not doing that to fill out this application, because one can almost always see through that. They actually genuinely take initiative. They actually genuinely want to make an impact. And so an initiative is, starting with an idea and taking steps to make it a reality with a tangible outcome. And I think one of the things this goes back to that I said sort of at the beginning is that self-driven piece, right? It's self-driven. I really want to learn more about this. I met with a student recently who is really interested in psychology, and she got a great idea of something that she'd like to do in her school, which is ultimately going to be, a tangible outcome. It will look good in the college process, but it's going to be good for her no matter what tier college she gets in, because she's genuinely interested in it. And that other piece, which sort of can beat off of the common good, is something that could have a lasting impact, right? And that could be common good, or that could be leadership. A question I like to ask students oftentimes when I'm talking to them is, like, how do you want your school to be different because you were a student in it? Like, what do you want it to be? Well, gosh, I always wish there was a this, or some of the things are simple. I remember a young man a few years ago, he loved chemistry. And he's like, we don't have a chemistry club. He wanted a chemistry club. Or some of them are much bigger, I want our school to address these issues by doing this. I want to join into a larger conversation than just my school. I had a young man a few years ago who, went to a school that wasn't terribly diverse, and he got involved in a consortium about diversity, and he became very interested in that, went to a national conference, came back, brought those ideas to his school. That could be anything. Like, what is it that you're so interested in that you would like to make an impact on at your school, in your community, in the state, wherever, but to make an actual impact. And how are initiative and impact evaluated? I think first is that it's genuine. I think that's so important. It's not on the slide, and I think, to me, I should add it on there, because I think that is so important. We do see our students who are, attending highly selective colleges impacting at a state, a national, and international level. So that is, the size of the arena matters. Colleges want to see the problems that students are they're committed to addressing. So again, it's that, what legacy will they leave? And I think that's a question that we're more and more seeing colleges trying to get at in applications. Like, what are you really about? Like, what do you really want to address in the world? There's not a right answer, except that there needs to be an answer. And I don't think our current education system, for the most part, is engaging students in those conversations. So I think we have to think about, what are the arenas where they can have those conversations? And certainly home is one of them. So I would encourage you, whether you're, whatever level college your student is wanting to apply to, I think that is a phenomenal conversation to have. We're especially seeing, actually, Claudia, I'm gonna have you speak to STEM students.
Yeah, I think that with STEM students in particular, we're seeing that depth exhibit itself in a lot of different ways. That natural curiosity, you see that progression over time with STEM students. They start asking more questions. You might see them engaging with STEM with like a chem club at first, and then they'll want to take it to another level. And they're like, you know what? How interesting would it be if I did X, Y, and Z next? And then you see them pursuing that. So that could be an internship, or they start having really meaningful conversations with people who are practicing chemists, as an example. But where I'm starting to see more from STEM is that you can't just do a one and done typically with STEM. Usually we want to see that commitment over time, because it takes time to develop those skills. And in any area, it takes time to develop skills. But a focused skill set in STEM does take a little bit more time. I also think that research is a huge piece to that. We're seeing more students engage with research, meaningful research. So some students are starting research as early as grades 10 and 11, because they're really wanting to have an understanding of, like, how do I ask questions and how do I get answers to that questions? If I'm curious about this, what is the process to investigate that? And I think some students do it on their own. I think an AP research class is a really great introduction to that, although I'm well aware that not all schools offer that class. So it's more about, how are we allowing students, or how is your student in particular asking those questions to really investigate them to a deep level? And I do want to address one thing in particular with all of this, because I'm seeing some discussion on the Q&A, and that is that this is not about having 8 million different activities on your resume or on your application. I'm not trying to overextend students. You should really be engaged with the things that you enjoy, but really that depth usually will manifest itself only in 2 or 3 different activities. So students will jump in deeply to a couple of different things and not in every single area. Okay, so if that means that your student's an athlete and they're taking that to a state and national level, fantastic. Okay, if that means that your student is the scientist and they have done research, multiple iterations of research over the summer, and are engaged with that community during the year, that's great. Okay, so it's not about doing a ton, but really investigating the things that you enjoy to that deeper level, and then sharing that joy with others. How are you sharing that joy?
Right. And I would say that one of the things that has become really important in the admissions process is that as students are doing these multi-year engagements, which is what we're seeing, then what is the artifact that they're holding it in is a really important piece that to think about. Like, are they gonna, if they're a STEM student, do they have a GitHub? Do they have a portfolio? Documenting things, is really important. Many students, when they get to the point of applying, may choose to have a simple, not fancy, not, go out and, just something simple website. So thinking about the documentation of what the student is doing is very important, especially as we, something I've seen in the change in the years that I've been doing this is this has become a more multi-year process. And so one of the things that often happens in that summer between junior and senior year is we're just trying to find everything, right, for the student to be able to document that. So thinking about now how to keep up with all of that is really important, because it chains a great story together. You know, I was working with a young man this summer, and I loved seeing some of the early work he did and where he's gotten. And so I think, you know, the people who are reading these are very human, you know, they are, you know, so we want to show that evolution, if you will. And so how you're going to actually document the initiative and impact is important. Let's just talk about a few students. And I think people sometimes like examples. Like, I'm just going to choose a couple here. A student who launched a travel YouTube channel and gained thousands of followers. A student who got a prestigious internship at a major cancer center, writing and producing a play that is performed at a local school. So those were all initiative. And then we see like where the student took it. The YouTube channel caught the attention of a producer who hired the student to do a series. Or the student's research was published in an academic journal, so it actually is out there to stay. Or the play got excellent reviews and it was picked up by a regional theater. This hits at something I think is so important. You started with an idea. Some of them will, you know, catch wind and fly high. And some of them, the student will decide they're not excited about them, or they just will never kind of get going. And as someone who works alongside students over many years, what I see is we don't know always which ones are going to catch flight and which ones aren't. I can rarely predict that when I'm helping a student think through things that they're interested in that they might want to pursue. And so I think that's an important piece, because I'm telling you the end of the story, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that your first thing out the gate is going to be that. Or maybe it will be, we don't know, you know. I had a young woman who hated exercise, never really had been an athlete, and she took up rowing because she didn't want to take PE, only to find out that she was a phenomenal rower and is now rowing for a top college in the country. She didn't think she was doing that when she signed up for rowing. So there's both planning that's involved in this, and there's some willingness to let things unfold. What we know doesn't work is not doing anything, right? So I think as parents and as people who walk aside students, that's a tricky little dance there to allow that space to happen. So now let's talk a little bit about application strategy. I know that many people on here have younger students and may not even be thinking anything near applications yet. And yet the reason that we include this in here is to frame where this is going in the college process. That's not to say it's the whole reason we're doing it. A few questions that I think you need to ask yourself. If you have, you're still in our webinar and you're like, I want to go for it. Have I taken the most rigorous courses? And so let's talk about the different kind of courses for a minute. We're in the Austin area. I know some of you are from all over the country, but if your school offers IB, that is typically considered the most rigorous curriculum that a student can take. Many schools start with AP. That at those schools would be the most rigorous coursework that a student can take. Dual credit on-ramps, things like that, are more rigorous than a regular course, but do not have that same level of rigor as APs or IB. So that's really important to know. Now, understand that everyone is going to be evaluated in the context of their high school. So if your high school doesn't offer AP classes or it doesn't offer the most rigorous courses, then you're not expected to take them. But in general, the students who are going for the most selective schools, where, especially in the big public schools, that's going to be an important factor, is taking the most rigorous courses in most subjects. Now, many high schools don't rank, but you can usually kind of get a feel of where your student is. But do you think that you're within, top 5, top 10% is going to be important? So getting kind of a realistic idea of that, to me, is really important. Looking at the depth of your resume, of the things that you've done for initiative and impact. If you're younger, I would say, if you're in the 9th or 10th grade, I would say first look at, what am I involved in and interested in? What's sparking interest? As Claudia said, what's going to bring you joy? So think about that and do more of those things. When you get to the point of writing college essays, do they highlight your unique intelligence, your curiosity, and your perspective? And parents, if I can say one thing that I would suggest you encourage your students to do at home, it's reflection. Our students have such a difficult time with the college writing process, not because they can't write, but because it's difficult for our kids to reflect, and I don't think they're getting that opportunity. So, and the college admission essay process is moving more and more to deep reflection. One of the things that we've started doing with our students is, after they do an activity, we have them write it, even if they're like, just to get them practicing, sort of like a muscle they're working, right? So that is really important, is that reflection piece. Essays are, puzzle pieces. I think that many students who kind of are excited about applying to highly selective schools don't always understand what that means for their college application process. We have seen a trend in COVID to colleges increasing the number of essays. So without giving you a whole primer on application, if you do the Common App, you have a main essay, but then the colleges have their what they call supplemental essays. We have seen a very large increase in the, especially this past cycle, in the number of essays the colleges are asking for, because they're trying to get to know you. They want to hear how you think to determine if you're going to be a good fit for their community. But it is an enormous amount of work that has to be planned for. And the student has to be willing to take some risks there, to show some vulnerability, and hopefully to have already had experiences that will give them places to, things to write about that show their reflection. Now, whenever we think about highly selective schools, there's almost always questions about, is it better to apply early decision? Is it better to, or restricted early action? Or there's like a bazillion different options. But is it better to apply in some kind of early pool, or is it better to apply regular decision? And in early decision, at some highly selective schools, you can get a nice bump for it. Now, you have to take into account that there's also legacy admissions in there, athletes and things. So those bumps are sometimes not as big as they actually look like. This isn't something that you need to worry about today, but it is something that you'll think about once you come to applying. What's the role of a parent in this process? I think this is so important. There's a lot of schools to choose from, and parents, many of us went to college many years ago. And so one thing that I encourage you to do is to look at colleges as they are today, not on your view of them say 20 years ago or so, because a lot has changed in the world of colleges and a lot of great programs have been added. And so look at these colleges, all the colleges that your students, look at them from where might my student thrive? It's very easy. All of us have done it, myself included, to get, enamored by the brand name kind of buzz, but really think about where your student's going to thrive. The other piece of that, start now focusing on what your student does. Help them explore majors, help them explore what they love to do. Because, if you look at much of the data of where people succeed in this country, it is from what they've done, not where they went. And so it is exceptionally important to help your student get focused on doing now. And that doesn't mean to apply or not to apply to a highly selective school, but that's going to help them thrive no matter what. So one of the things I really encourage parents to do, spend some time thinking with your student, help them through this. They don't know, they've never had an internship. Do you know someone that you could introduce them to where they could explore creative writing or explore engineering or explore business? Probably you do. Help them make those connections, because those connections will help move them forward in the college process no matter where they end up going. And I would say a few things on nurturing engagement with your student. Listen, students will say some things about the college process that you're going to be like, you want what? And they're going to change their mind a lot because they have never done this before. If the number one thing that students say to me that they wish people would stop asking them is where they want to go to college, because they have no idea. And that's because they've never done this before. And so they need the space to evolve, right? Help them connect to resources. I think this is so important. I think that, sometimes it's like, oh, parents shouldn't get involved. Get involved, like definitely help them connect to resources, engagement, encourage their interests, do some things with them at any age. I think we underestimate sometimes. Maybe your family has a problem you want to solve, and you work on that together. Pursue engagement as a family and encourage reflection as a family. I'm not going to read this whole slide to you because it's really, really long, but it's really just for students to say, in high school engagement, here's some things you want to do. Here in college planning, here's some things you want to do. In essays and applications, here's some things you want to do. And then here's some things you might want to avoid, okay? The one I'm going to pick out in high school engagement is avoid the cookie cutter. You don't want to look like everyone else. So avoid it. Figure out what makes you excited, motivated, engaged, and go for that, because it'll probably be really interesting. Because, whenever I read, your engagement is ultimately going to be written about in an essay. And whenever I read a lot of college essays in a year, and one of the things I always think about is like, you can feel it when it's like that same essay you've heard 6 times, or it's like, wow, this is really interesting. It's so that student. Don't wait until junior year. If you are genuinely considering highly selective colleges, it's a 4-year journey. That does not mean that you should be talking about college for 4 years. Let me get that straight. But getting some things in place, starting to explore activities, those kind of things need to naturally be progressing through the years. That does not mean that you should be talking about college all the time. No matter how able you are, no matter how many great things you've done, no matter if you've taken the hardest classes ever put on this earth, build a college list that is broad and wide. This process of college admissions has become asymmetrical. You don't know how it's going to go. And the truth is that students can be happy in many colleges. So don't back yourself into a corner. I think it's the number one mistake that students and families that have their eye on highly selective colleges, that's all they want to talk about. And they never want to talk about the rest of the list. And the student could end up going to a college in the rest of the list. So it's really important, no matter what your hopes are, that that list is broad and that you have gotten to know all those colleges, that you're not just focusing on these very top colleges. When you get to the application, just because it's my pet peeve, don't crowdsource your essay. A good essay from a 17-year-old is so much better than a crowdsourced essay where, you know, the marketing director's gotten in it, that this person's gotten in it. It doesn't sound like the student anymore. Those are a few tips. There's certainly more. Feel free to go through this. But I think those are some things that help students thrive. But I want to go back to something Claudia said. This is supposed to be enjoyable. This is not supposed to be a burden. And so I encourage you to be working to do things that you actually really enjoy. Take courses that you actually enjoy. Thrive in high school doing the things that you do well. Any last questions? We've got a couple of minutes. And if anybody has a last question, Claudia, is there anything you wanted to add as a wrap up? Anything that we left out that you thought of that you wanted to mention?
Just returning to crowdsourcing your essays, by the way, we can tell on the admissions side if it's too many people who have been editing or overworking that essay, because again, it doesn't sound like a 17-year-old. And by the way, mom and dad, you don't write well. You have forgotten, or your industry has pushed you to write a particular way. So writing like a high school student is very different from how you write. So I also put that out there as well in case you feel the need to edit or write pieces for your students, which usually does not work. But I do think that this can be a lot of fun. I think there's so many choices out there, and I find that students who are willing to think about where they thrive and grow really do best in this process, and they find this process to not be a process, but actually exciting to think about the possibilities for their future.
Right. And this should be exciting. And, you know, on Claudia's point about the essays, admissions people always tell us they can tell if there's two spaces after the period that it definitely wasn't written by a 17-year-old. So have some fun with this process. It's, you know, many students are working so hard. And I guess I would leave you with one last thing. Let your student thrive in the college that's really going to be a great match for them. We live in a world where a lot of kids have amazing grades. Some of them don't want to do all of this extra stuff. That's okay. There are so many phenomenal colleges out there. They may not be as well known because they may not have been as exciting location. They may not have as big as endowment. That does not mean your student can't get a phenomenal education. We are so grateful that you chose to spend this time with us. As we said at the beginning, we will be sending out the deck as well as the recording. And we're grateful that you came to share your Sunday afternoon with us. Thank you so much.